time today, Michael.
No, I appreciate it. Really appreciate it. Thanks for taking your time as well.
Sure. So I want to start with, for people who are watching who might not know your work or what it is that you do,
Sure.
If you could do a quick self-introduction.
Sure. What we do is we investigate consumption trends within China by speaking to consumers. So our key point of difference is that we do in-depth ethnographic research with Chinese consumers all across the country, going into their homes, understanding about their lives, and then understanding about how they use or engage with the client's product category.
And so can you tell us a little bit more about what that actually looks like when you're on the ground, when you go out and meet people, or you're doing the work for your clients? What is it that you're actually doing?
Sure. So I guess it's sort of broken into a couple of different phases. There's the stuff up front, which is the boring stuff, I suppose, of the desktop research and having a look at what the category looks like at the moment, the competitive landscape. But then within that, there's actually quite some interesting stuff around semiotics, which is this idea of using codes, visual codes, to be able to decode a category. So, for instance, how are mothers depicted in infant formula packaging or infant formula products? So being able to look at those sort of images and pull out, well, where are the areas for differentiation? Once we've done some of that work, then we'll go out into the field. And what that looks like is trips across the country. So we might do first, second and third tier cities, or we might do first and second tier cities, depending on the client needs. And we meet with consumers. So we recruit all those consumers internally. We enter their homes, we go shopping with them or do the activity that the client's interested in, and that process for each consumer lasts anywhere from 3 to 3.5 hours, and then we'll try and do 3 of those a day, plus the travel time in between, the different respondents' homes and breaks and everything like that leads to some pretty long days, but ultimately it's all worth it to be able to get inside the heads of today's modern Chinese consumer.
I'd love to hear why you got interested in China in the first place.
Sure.
Why did you come here? And then why have you come back, right? You come back recently. Why did you come back to work here?
Sure. So the start of my China journey, I suppose, was during university. So Australia has a fantastic higher education system which encourages you to do a double degree, so you do 2 degrees simultaneously. I did Law and Asian Studies, and as part of the Asian Studies degree I did some electives in Chinese Mandarin, and I was fortunate enough on the basis of my grades to be awarded a scholarship, and that scholarship at the time was called the Prime Minister's Asia Endeavour Award. Now that sounds like a mouthful. It's equivalent to the UK's Rhodes Scholarship or the American Fulbright, so it allows for study abroad, all funded and supported by the government, with the intention of strengthening the students' or the candidates' understanding of that particular Asian country. So I chose China, and my institution destination was Tsinghua University, where I studied a whole range of stuff, but my main focus was Chinese literature, modern Chinese literature. So I was in Beijing across 2014 and 2015, really studying, just really sort of in the language and immersed in the culture. And at that point, I decided to return to Australia to commence my professional career. I worked as a couple of years as a management consultant at Australia's top management consulting firm, and then Jerry Claude, who heads up Smart Research as part of Resonance China, contacted me and said, hey, you look like somebody who knows a thing or two about China research and consulting methodology. How would you like the opportunity to come and work in this environment and be exposed to today's modern Chinese consumer? And I thought that was a great opportunity, and so I packed up my bags really quickly. The time from offer to foot on the ground was something like 3 weeks, sort of leaving my employer at the time, my family and friends all kind of like bewildered. So 3 weeks from sort of having a pretty decent career as a management consultant to then packing up everything and coming across. And so I've been here ever since.
Before you came to China the first time,
yes.
What were some assumptions that you had about what it was actually like here?
Sure.
And then when you started studying the literature, the culture, and actually spent time in Beijing, what did you learn that was different? And then the second time that you came back, because the first time you weren't really working here.
Sure,
right?
correct.
what did you find different about the business world here as opposed to working in Australia?
Sure. So in terms of coming over, my sort of preconceptions of Chinese universities would be that they would be sort of highly regimented places, but I found that in fact the opposite is true. It's much more freestyle compared to the high school. So there is this sort of come down from the pressures of high school and then a sort of a release period during university that picks up again maybe towards the end of students' university career when they start looking at employment outcomes and these sort of things. But it was great to be able to see these students at I guess a relaxed and happy stage of their life, kind of like that release valve had been turned off. They were very social and sociable, and sort of the number of student societies and student associations and the life on campus and the vibrancy surprised me a lot. And so coming back this time as a professional, I think the thing that has struck me is how this 996 culture seems to have shifted from a sort of an internet-only phenomenon to a workplace expectation. Now, I mean, I worked in management consultancy before, which is no stranger to sort of long hours and all-nighters and these sort of things. But being able to see that filter into, I guess, professional services here and have that expectation of performance sort of come across a wider variety of professional services, not just limited to things like management consultancy, investment banking or accounting, really struck me. There's a lot of motivation to go places here, and I think what that manifests itself in is a great desire to self-learn. And so I've always sort of had a high regard for people's ability to be able to knuckle down and study for that next thing, which I think, at least in Australia, in certain industries, tends to drop off once you finish university.
Fascinating. Can you tell us a little bit about the difficulties that you encountered, you know, as an Australian living in China, both personally and then professionally? If you can give us, you know, maybe one or two examples of stuff that was challenging, and then how you overcame that.
Sure. So in terms of personally, this year our family's been a little bit unfortunate in the sense that my grandfather and grandmother both passed away. I'm personally still dealing with that, and it's just part of being an expatriate that you might not be able to go back before they pass, and you might not be able to say the things that you want to say. That complicates the grieving process, and so I think that's part of my big awakening this year is that it's great to be abroad, and it's absolutely fantastic, and you learn a lot and you grow a lot, but don't forget where you came from, and that family connection needs to be maintained. And in terms of the professional sense, what I'm still getting adjusted to is this idea of, okay, well, I've got my stuff at Smart, and then I've also contribute on LinkedIn and have all this sort of content distribution, and then other sort of side things that come up from time to time. So for instance, some Australian companies might say, hey Michael, do you know anything about this or anything about that? Can you introduce us to these people or these people? And it's just a case for me of being able to understand, well, where are my limits and what am I going to be focused on, and where can I make the most impact in terms of value exchange for these sort of one-off introductions, or is it something that I need to focus on in terms of content? Do I need to be listening to my audience a little bit more? Just that sort of selection of the different opportunities and selective focus of effort is something that I need to work on a little bit more. A good coping strategy that I have at the moment is to have my goals really clear, and then make sure that the opportunity matches to those goals, but at the same time maintain the flexibility that I can have things that I hadn't contemplated before come through the door. So the opportunity to do this interview, for instance, might not be something that I would be focused on this quarter or this half of the year, but I thought, hey, we'll give it a go and we'll see what it leads to, right? So you've got to have a framework, but at the same time the framework has to have enough looseness in it to be able to accommodate chance or fortune or these sort of things.
Your understanding of the Chinese consumer, right? This is your expertise, right? You go out and interview people. What have been some of the sort of the higher level learnings for you of going out and meeting, like how many people has it been so far that you've interviewed in total?
Since coming to China, I think I would have been in, I don't know, rounding up maybe 100 interviews, so 80 at a conservative, 100 at a top.
So after having talked in depth to 100 people about their consumer habits and how they make their decisions, if you look at those 100, what would you say are some of the key things that you can take out? And like I know China's a big place, and I know you're also focusing on different demographics, but for people looking from the outside and having zero understanding, or very little understanding of what it's actually like in China, what would you say are some of the key learnings that you've taken away from it?
Okay, some of the key things I think is the first is the frictionless in terms of the digital ecosystems that people search, browse, purchase, interact, whatever. The idea that you can go from seeing to buying in the one place without switching between different platforms, I think for people looking on the outside, this might be a new phenomenon. So this idea of if you're in Instagram, for instance, and you click on a link, you get a redirect, but here it's all taken care of within the one place. So I think that's the first thing, just to understand that the degree of frictionlessness here is much lower than it is in the West. The second thing is that I found that consumers are less picky or selective with the platforms they use than we might think. So coming into the job, I thought that every platform was a deliberate choice, that there was a reason behind using that platform over another platform. Now, with some consumers there is. They could have had a bad experience which may have led to a diversion or a switch, or they might have heard that another service was superior or that products were better. But there's still a lot of inertia around. So this idea of search engines, for instance, so most consumers are still on Baidu and they're not looking to switch to another search engine. So for instance, a Sogo or a Shenma. The reason for that when you ask them is, I'm just used to it. So this idea of inertia being or leading to some constant forces in China's digital landscape, I think is something to bear in mind as well. And there might not be a specific reason why consumers use one platform over another, especially where they've got multiple platforms over the phone. It might be something a little less deliberate. And so being able to live with that lack of causality, I think, has been a big learning for me. And then the third thing that I would sort of take away out of that 100 is the level of importance that's attached to different life stages. The Chinese have an interesting way of being able to break down life. Pregnancy for women is a big deal. So this idea of pre-pregnancy, post-pregnancy, the triggers that makes in a person's life and the choices that cascades into when it comes to nutrition, exercise, worldview, outlook on children, family, etc. are huge. And so being able to understand from a cultural standpoint why 25, 30, pre-pregnancy, post-pregnancy, marriage, family, perhaps the passing of someone in your family, 40, 50. Why these milestones are important culturally in China is an important way to be able to unlock some things or some thinking that you might not have thought about before. So the idea of fortified products or pregnancy milk for mothers being set into stages just like a baby. So this idea of infant formula going from stage 1 to stage 4, well, why can't you apply the same thinking to pregnancy milk for mothers? Because culturally they believe that the first 3 months is fundamentally different from the next 3 months and then the next 3 months and then post-birth. So why can't you stage that up as well? It just unlocks a different way of thinking about consumers' consumption patterns and the drivers behind certain psychological decisions and life changes.
A lot of the people that I'm interviewing are entrepreneurs, so you're in a little bit of a different boat when I'm coming at these questions.
Yes.
For most people, I'll be asking like how specifically they got into their niche.
Yes.
But I'd like to hear from your perspective of, businesses that are coming into China.
Yes.
How did they determine what is the best niche for them to get into?
Okay. So I think it's worth with anything having a good framework to think about these things. So The framework that I often put to our clients is that it's better to be the top one in a smaller category or a smaller vertical rather than it is to be top 5 in a much bigger one. So where does that niche exist? That's built on a really solid category review. So this idea of looking at what's on offer, then looking at the cultural trends and where things are shifting to. So for instance, education, the time I think for international schools here, the sort of the golden age is moving a little bit, but what direction is it moving? The parents still want 21st century skills for their children, but is it the case that that is necessarily fostered in a Western institution or an English-speaking institution? That's where the challenge is. So how, in that context, could an educational offer come in and be able to service that need or service that thinking? That's the sort of thinking that you need to unlock, and then that sort of discovery phase and validation phase with the consumers. So being able to take an open mind to what consumers are thinking, not projecting on them, I think is an important element. And then secondly, once you've got a rough idea or a rough sort of indication of what direction you'd like to move in, then validating that. And all this process, I think, has to be done relatively quickly, but the quickness shouldn't come at the expense of robustness. We see too often foreign brands looking to enter China. They think they've got a great niche, but that niche may not be what they think. It might be adequately serviced by another product, or alternatively, that niche might exist for a brief window of time, and that window closes because of certain decision making and certain inertia within the organisation.
And so for people who are thinking about coming in and maybe they're still small scale,
Sure.
don't have a lot of money to invest
Sure.
in like proper research,
Sure.
getting someone like yourself
Sure.
to go out and do interviews,
Sure.
where would you recommend they start in terms of trying to do their own research? Like how
Sure.
do they try to find out about those demographic groups so
Sure.
they can
Sure.
figure out that niche?
So I think the wonderful thing about China is that the whole world comes to play, insofar as every country will have its own trade and investment sort of outpost here. They're a great place to start. The resources that the Australians, the New Zealanders, the British, the Americans, those are the ones that I'm most familiar with, provide to their members are extensive. And that may...
Like the chambers of commerce?
Yes, correct, exactly. So these sort of, the chambers of commerce, or the sort of the trade and enterprise drivers and these sort of organisations, they sit on a lot of stuff. The trick, I think, when you're on a budget and looking, or maybe sort of still trying to find your feet in market, is to tap them up as much as possible, because chances are they will have access to it if they don't have it already. So that's a great place to start for startups, I think, is aligning with these, and that might necessitate a membership fee, but the cost of that membership fee is far less than consultancy services, for instance. Then once you've got that in your hot little hand, the next step, I think, is to ensure that you validate it. So this idea that a study or some data from 2016, it may or may not hold in 2018. It depends on the product category, it depends on the data set, it depends on how the study was originally conducted, where it was conducted, all sorts of different factors. So a little bit of sense checking once you've got that will go a long way.
You're very active on LinkedIn. I am too, and it helps to sort of see who is in the space and
Yes,
sharing
correct.
information. So there's not a lot of people who I see who speak good Chinese,
Okay.
Who sort of have an in-depth of the culture. Like I find some like Chinese scholars,
Yes.
right? Like foreign Chinese scholars who have really good Chinese,
Yes.
but then maybe like the business side of it they don't
Yes.
have as much understanding.
Yes.
Whereas you seem to have this nice mix of like you're a management consultant,
Yes.
and also you understand the culture to a deep extent,
Sure.
and also you speak the language.
Sure.
So from the perspective of people trying to enter the market,
Yes.
who maybe don't speak Chinese,
Yes.
or don't necessarily understand the culture,
Yes.
how important do you think those aspects are in leveraging the growth of China to do business?
So I think it's worth differentiating the two groups of people that might come to China. The first is that those are looking to do business, and then those who are looking to be professionals. Start with the professionals like myself first. I think the language has shifted very quickly from an optional to a must-have, and that shift I think was about 3 years. So from when I was here in 2015 and asking around, sort of the foreign companies that were here, whether or not they had any openings or vacancies or what have you, the number one consideration for them was work experience, not language. Now, coming back, when I look around and friends ask me, well, what should my next career move be, or I'm looking to come to China to work in an accounting firm or a law firm, what are the skills I need to have? Language is an absolute must. So that shift, at least anecdotally for me, has been about 3 years. So having the language and your professional skills is the way to go. Having just good Chinese, no professional skills, likewise. Unfortunately, at the moment, it's the competition's too fierce for you to be able to crack in effectively. Then for the business side, I think time in country is important if you can't speak the language. A good example is Oyo Rooms, which is an Indian unicorn funded by SoftBank. They took 3 years to become number one in India via room volume. So they're huge. They're looking to enter China. They've already entered China, and they project that within 3 years their revenue here will be 60% of their entire operations. The CEO and the COO can't speak Chinese. They have interpreters attached to them at all times, but they're here 20 days a month. Unthinkable for the largest hotelier in India. The CEO and the COO are in China 20 days a month, and not their core market just yet, but it soon will be. So that time in country, I think, can compensate for some, not necessarily all. It would be optimal if you had a mix of everything, but if you don't, then the time in country and that willingness to listen and learn and have the ability for the people around you to give you accurate descriptions of what's going on, I think will make up for it to some extent.
And so for people who were sort of saying, I think I should learn Chinese,
yes,
but I don't know where to start. Like, it's a hard language.
Yes,
right?
Correct.
And I see you sort of sharing some tips sometimes about how you learn Chinese and what worked for you.
Yes.
For people who are sort of like, yes, I want to invest time, I want to invest energy, but I want to do it in a smart way.
Yes.
What tips would you have for people to get to a decent level of Chinese?
So I suppose I can only speak from my own experience. I gave up handwriting characters very early on in the piece. So I took Chinese electives during my degree, and then from I think it was semester 2 of first year Chinese, I said, no, not writing the characters. I'm going to spend all the time on listening, reading, and speaking. And I didn't turn up for the written examinations. I just did the listening, the reading, and the speaking components. I got by. And now, when I think about it, the amount of times that I've had to handwrite characters, there's only been one time, opening a bank account. And at that time I had my smartphone and I was just copying against my address that I'd written down before. I think that's one time saver. But you have to check whether or not that's right for you. Some people find that recall of individual characters is assisted by writing. For those folks, maybe that's not an appropriate strategy. Another one I think it's worth bearing in mind is that things are digitized now. It's not like the older China hands that may have some reservations about, Chinese is a really hard language. I think it's that Paul Moser article that's kind of like, you shouldn't really, it's insane to try. That's you've got to remember the context for those folks is a paper dictionary, as opposed to all the sort of software and applications that we have. So I think that's a big bonus. The barriers to entry are certainly decreasing, and anecdotally, the people that are around me that speak half-decent Chinese are also increasing. So I think there's something in that. And then the last thing I think is to try and wean yourself off this sort of material for second language learners as quickly as possible. The sort of, I'm not sure what textbooks you had when you started, but we had a new practical Chinese reader, and that was stiff as, like there's no way that some of those conversations would take place in real life. And so being able to wean yourself off that as quickly as possible, and even if it means taking somewhat of a depressing and self-defeating trip to the bookshop and looking at the graded children readers, like 4-year-old, 5-year-old, 6, 7, 8, whatever it is, whatever suits your particular level at that period of time, and getting into what kids at that age are reading and learning, as opposed to a textbook directed at foreign language learners. I think that's a smart move as well.
So when we say culture,
yes.
Chinese culture,
yes,
I think it's difficult to grasp, right? Because
sure.
it's a huge country.
Cool.
With all these different, like, 少数民族, all
yes.
the different tribes, and,
yes.
and whether it's different geographical regions,
yes.
different tiers of cities,
yes.
It can be difficult, I think, for people to grasp what it actually
yes.
means.
Sure.
What does Chinese culture mean?
Sure.
What have been some things that you've taken away? Because you studied the literature first of all, which
yes.
is kind of like a bit more
yes.
sort of old style Chinese culture,
yes.
right?
Sure.
And then more recently you're into like the really modern day consumer.
Yes.
So what are some of those things from the old style culture that is relevant today
yes.
in terms of doing business?
Sure.
And what are some of the new pieces that seem to be rising out in the culture here that might not be typically seen as Chinese culture?
Sure. Okay. So breaking those down, I think the one thing that I picked up from my literature studies, so I studied late Qing Dynasty literature. That was the point in China's history where Western powers had introduced themselves to China, and China was still coming to grips with whether or not it was a modern society relative to Western powers. Now that thematically is very similar to what we see today. So in terms of this grip of whether it is better for Chinese enterprises to copy or to learn, to put it more sort of euphemistically, or to have this homegrown approach, is something that we see today. So that cultural element will give you a lens to say that the challenges that China's industrial sort of progress is coming to grips with today are not too dissimilar, thematically at least, from what took place more than 100 years ago. And then in terms of what we're seeing that's new or emerging, I think it's less of new but more of a fusion. Now, the fusion from a Chinese perspective is different from a Western perspective because we all come at it from a different cultural lens. So Douyin is a great example. Western commentators might liken it to a Vine. But for Chinese that have never seen Vine or had access to Vine, this idea of skits that take place in a short amount of time is a new thing. But for us, it's just copying Vine. So being able to just understand how that lens is applied to new things, and just being able to interrogate what the meaning of new actually means, is an interesting point. I think this sort of perennial debates about whether or not Chinese are becoming more individualistic, or whether or not there's more freedom in terms of movement, speech, etc. than what we've had in the past. What they don't do is they don't look at it necessarily from the perspective of the Chinese consumer themselves. So a great example of this is what we're seeing now is we're seeing trading up behaviour and trading down behaviour taking place at the same time. Now, from a developed economy standpoint, trading up behaviour and trading down behaviour taking place at the exact same time is perfectly normal. People might buy a more expensive pair of sneakers, but at the same time they might economise on flights or accommodation. It's normal. But from the Chinese perspective, this idea of coming to grips with trading down behaviour and even inventing a word to describe that phenomenon, 消费降级, is just this incredible step because, and we've got to understand the context, because ever since 1978, it's always been trading up. we've been less about trading up and trading down at the same time. So for them, coming to grips with economization and at the same time trading up is a new thing. So we've just got to understand where people come from when they're talking about new or fusion or these sort of things. So again, that's sort of something with Chinese characteristics. I think we'll see more of that phrase, as hackneyed as it is, than less in the coming years.
When we think about building relationships in China, we hear about this word guanxi. From your perspective, what is guanxi really about, and how can people build it?
Sure. Guanxi is, I think it's important to get the connection. So this idea, that's often translated. Most people will be able to get that. The second, I think, is value exchange. That's the part that doesn't quite register with as many people. The value exchange is not a one-off transactional value exchange. It is a continuous process. And that continuous process might last for the period of cooperation. It might last beyond that. It might last your whole entire life. And the value exchange is not manifested in giving gifts, even though there's certain Chinese phrases that might give the indication that it's gift giving. So this idea of so this idea of giving sort of begets reciprocity and these sort of things. And there is often interpreted as a physical gift, but really that li is the same li as used in courtesy. And so that value exchange doesn't have to be I'll give you this and then you'll give me that, and it's a material sort of thing. It can be support. It can be the idea of being able to introduce somebody to somebody else. Now that's when we think about connections, that's fine. But from a value exchange perspective, it's extending that person's network. It's helping them get out of a jam, or helping them find an in a situation where they might not have had that resource in the first place. So connection plus value exchange is how I would define guanxi. And then it's the differential between having that connection or that friendship and value exchange with a person, and being able to achieve an objective that Western people often think is interlinked. So once we've got these connections, then it'll make it easier for us to do A, B, C, or D. Rather, it's you can apply a different lens to it, which is kind of like a networked economy lens, which is sort of building these connections and fostering a community which is built on value exchange. Eventually leads to some form of monetization. That's a sort of like a straight from Kevin Kelly sort of new age economy sort of thinking, and you can apply that to this. So any sort of network community, whether it's a neighborhood, whether it's a suburb, whatever, as long as there's a sufficient number of connections, the wheels of the economy will begin to spin, and you'll get some sort of economic benefit from it. It might not be the benefit that you desire, but it'll be some sort of benefit from it. So establishing and maintaining long-term value exchange, I don't think is unique to Chinese culture. I think we can take our own experience and apply it there. The differential sort of element is maybe on the extent to which it permeates the society, as opposed to it permeates maybe more closed circles in the West. So this idea of, when I was in Melbourne, I spent a lot of time in the art circle, and these sort of very wealthy individuals who all know each other, and they'll have dinner parties together and stuff like that. And they might give tickets to each other, or they might introduce them to certain products or experiences. That's a form of value exchange which takes place in a Western context. You can apply that lens to the Chinese context.
You mentioned Kevin Kelly there, which I love because I'm a huge fan of his work.
Yes.
And I think one of the things that's interesting about Kevin is that he's one of those Westerners who does spend a lot of time over this side of the world.
Yes.
Like he travels around Asia a lot.
Yes, correct.
And he sees, I think, a lot of these tech trends, not just from a Western perspective, but he can see it on a global perspective.
Correct.
And so I'd love to hear from you, seeing that you're also familiar with his work, what are some of the things in terms of the tech digital ecosystem here in China that you find are concepts that maybe don't quite exist in the West yet, or that Westerners might not fully understand in terms of the trends and how it's developing?
Sure. So I think one of the fundamentals from Kevin Kelly is this idea of digital ecosystems. He makes the point very early on that digital will exist as an ecosystem because being able to capture and monetize traffic or connections or nodes in the network, as he refers to them, is the game. And in terms of Western tech startups, when we think about them, they've got this sort of industrial era age of providing a solution to a problem. It's just that it's a tech-enabled problem. Some have made the leap to ecosystems via sort of acquisition or expansion, and that's fine. But here, what you see is a more pure form of ecosystem thinking. This idea of, well, if it's a mobility solution, what adjacents do I need to have? And those adjacents serve two purposes. The first is they build an ecosystem. The second is that when we think about Kevin Kelly, when he talks about what actually disrupts incumbents, he says that it is adjacents rather than industry incumbents or industry peer competitors. And so that guards against, so this expansion guards against the prospect of for instance, a car-hailing company also doing deliveries, it guards against an Uber Eats sort of prospect appearing against your ride-hailing service. So, in that sense, I think the ecosystem thing will eventually converge. But in that sense, the Chinese think a little bit more about ecosystems than I think their Western counterparts do.
One of the things that I find hugely valuable about following you on social media is how up to date you are with the stuff that's coming out. Part of it, I hear you explaining in terms of the fact that you read a lot of stuff in Chinese, and that comes out faster than like if you were to wait for the English version, which is later.
Correct.
How do you personally keep up to speed with everything that's going on? Because there's so much happening here. What are your personal strategies or tactics for doing that? And what advice would you have for people who are maybe not experts like you, so they can't spend all their time doing that?
Yes, sure. So I think the thing is to sort of isolate what it is you're concerned about. I, for instance, am not particularly concerned with the news of Facebook or Google entering China. I'm more concerned about what is happening, for instance, inside WeChat in terms of e-commerce, or what is happening in terms of sort of WeChat official accounts being used more or less. Now that's a function of my personal sort of work and interest, but the reason why I focus on those as opposed to tech giants coming into the market is that the number of ifs and the path of resistance for that eventuality is much greater than what's already happening or what's already taking place. It's very easy for instance, an e-commerce upstart to sort of do its thing inside WeChat than it is for Google to launch a search engine, get acceptance, and then make an impact in terms of user behavior. So for me, it's a time priority, what can shift faster. And then in terms of, once you've isolated the things that you're concerned about and why you should be concerned about them, then it's important to get good news sources. So I'm very fortunate that I have a lot of friends who know that I keep up to date with these sort of things and will refer me stuff and flick me stuff, but I don't read it automatically. I've got time set aside for reading, and that time I try and use to the max, sort of optimize it as much as I can. So it's not a case of me scanning the headlines every day like a newspaper or anything like that. I think that things here happen fast, but not so fast that maybe an hour on a Sunday afternoon can't help you sort of catch up with in one hit rather than reading through the week. So my tips there would be first, really understand what you're trying to find out about. The country's huge, as you said. It's impossible to keep up with everything. What are the things that matter to you, and what are the things that you can outsource to other people to tell you, and then you can look into it yourself and do the thought that's required to have an opinion. And then the second is, well, how are you reading and how are you optimizing your time? Are you, for instance, having a China e-commerce hour? And that sounds really bland and really horrible, but if you implement that sort of practice, you will find that your time will be better spent than a casual read in the afternoon about what's happening here, what's happening there. Flicking through, the attention switching costs are quite high, so just try and optimize your personal reading time to be able to get ahead in the way that you want to.
So as someone who's very close to the ground,
yes,
more so than maybe anyone else I know personally,
yes,
in terms of you're traveling around a
sure,
lot, speaking directly to the customers
sure,
or
yes,
consumers.
yes.
What do you see as some of the trends that are happening now?
Yes.
That people can take advantage of, the waves that are coming, that people should be aware of,
yes,
as they're thinking about doing business in China?
Okay, so the number one thing I think that we should be concerned with as foreign businesses entering China is how the what I like to call the activity center of both millennials and their older peers are going through at the moment. What we're seeing is the activity center sort of contracting from there are 3 places in Beijing that I go for shopping and relaxation and sort of catching up with friends, to one main activity center. Now that's a phenomenon of big city life. It's also a phenomenon of things coming towards the residential complexes. So this idea of the things around, the Chinese word is 小区, this idea of the residential complexes becoming more and more developed and more accessible. So a good example of this is a Hema supermarket. Before, you might have had to travel to a hypermarket some way away to be able to access high quality food and produce. But now with Hema, they've sort of inserted themselves in between a high concentration of xiaoqus. Now what that means is that the activity center for that family or household will go from where that hypermarket was. So maybe it was let's say, just taking Shanghai as an example, maybe it was near Qing'an, and now that's contracted it toward more of the home. What happens then is a Starbucks opens up around next to the Hema, and you have an agglomeration of food outlets of the same quality that you would have normally had at the shopping centre, that's getting closer and closer to your xiaoqu. So how can Western businesses insert themselves into that smaller activity centre? This affects everything from your retail strategy, where you're having your stores. So locations that might have been optimal in the past may no longer be optimal. It also affects your sort of your promotional activity. Well, why is it more important to go into the residential complexes than it was ever before? And then what that lends itself into, especially at the more complex sort of big picture stuff, is how we think about the concept of aging in Chinese society will also shift. Australia has the benefit of having first-class aged care residential facilities as well as in-home care. What I'm seeing more of is a tendency towards more in-home care. So this idea of a nursing station or an equivalent being stationed within a xiaoqu, and it services that xiaoqu so that you have a set number of nurses that do home visits for the residents in that xiaoqu. Although they don't need to go to a hospital or a clinic or whatever just for the sort of the ordinary sort of Mrs. Zhang will take your readings and will make sure you're okay. So that activity centre contracting, I think that's something that we need to pay close attention to. The second is this idea of the trading up and the trading down happening at the same time. So young people, as much as we sort of say, oh, there's all sorts of research reports going around that they're very happy spenders and things like that, you've got to understand what that spending is being built upon. There are some rather frightening studies or anecdotes that say that anywhere up to 30 or 40% of young people's income is subsidised by their parents. What happens when mum and dad have that sort of shift and say, well, I'm sorry, Xiaoming, we're going on a holiday, and that means that your monthly allowance is going to be cut. Or, Xiaoming, you've reached 27 or 28, you've got to be able to go it on your own. What happens in that context where that extra 30 or 40% buffer is taken away or contracts? What categories will be impacted the most, and what categories will be able to survive that because the focus on the premium is far more important than having tighter pockets. So just being able to pay attention to these two things, just those two, opens up a lot of possibilities for your China thinking, as it were.
So looking at these trends that are happening right now, what would you say are some of the untapped opportunities that still exist for mostly foreign businesses that are trying to enter China or that are trying to start up here? Like what spaces are going to be difficult for foreigners to enter into in that like the competition is too fierce from Chinese people who have the resources or whether it's financial or connections to get into? Like what spaces can foreigners come into here and be successful?
So I think a good recipe for success is built upon the industries that foreign companies already do rather well in here or disproportionately do well. So the idea of health, nutrition, skin care, infant care, sort of aging, these sort of education, these sort of constants, I think will continue at least for the next 5 years. Now, the nature of these will shift, however. So, for instance, we'll see much more specific need states being expressed and articulated. So, the new product development for Western companies and Western sort of market entrants will need to be at a different cycle than it is abroad. So let me give you an example. What we found is that here the sort of the women's ultivite, so this idea of a multivitamin for women that are 50